Hey class, this is one of two introductions to the Romantic period. This one's going to focus more on the history and political things going on because when you're studying literature, you really have to understand what's going on, at least in my perspective. Like, if we don't know what's happening in history, then why does it matter what they're saying or how they're saying it? Because I think the two are like connected really closely. So part one is the history, and you'll watch part two, which is the characteristics and literary movements next. Before we get into the history, though, I do just want to explain that when we talk about the Romantic movement, we're not talking about like romance like we'd consider today. So like cheesy romance novels, chick flicks, like any like, oh my god, I'm in love. That's not what we mean. Like, yes, there's going to be love. That's just a normal human emotion, but that's not the focus. Instead, we're looking back at medieval romances, which was a type of writing that dealt with like knights going off on quest, courtly love, all those kinds of things, strange new environments. So we're going back to those ideas. The Romantic movement in general is looking for an adventure, it's looking for a break from reality. We're returning to the historic traditions and focusing on our individualities as humans and admiring the natural world. Because in the previous time period, if you've studied Brit Lit 1 or the Restoration in the 18th century, you'll know that like we got back to this idea of like human nature is the same everywhere. Well, in reaction to that, the Romantics are like, no, I am an individual. Like, this is my perspective and how I experience things. This period is very poetry heavy, but there's also some prose. Novels are exploding. We don't see a lot of theater, so we probably won't really get any of that in this unit. But we're very into poetry at this time, just as a heads up. So, when does this happen? This is the shortest literary movement in British history in the way we categorize them, but there's a lot of complex things happening, and therefore the time range is kind of hard to nail down. We're going to study it as 1785 to 1832. There's a little overlap with the 18th century because 1785 is in the 18th century, even though we're starting new things. You'll see different scholars say, oh, it started in 1776, or it didn't start until 1789. 1776, American Revolution. In 1783, is the defeat in the American Revolution. 1789, the French Revolution has kicked off. But any one date that a scholar might choose to start this period is connected to a large political and social event, because that is controlling a lot of what's happening in the period and the reactions to it. However, the end date is always the same, 1832, which is the first reform bill in Parliament, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, the history. What's going on? Well, there's a lot of revolution and reactions, like I mentioned. What you need to know is the current king is George III. By 1788, he starts having mental breakdowns, so we can assume that when we're starting this period in 1785, that he's already having some like mental strain going on, but that causes problems. Now, when he first came in, he focused on Britain and like wanting to make some changes for the better for the country. By the end of his revolution, he is, not revolution, by the end of his ruling, he's a little bit more controlling. He wants to keep that power tightly in there. There is a lot of discontent on the home front. So not only are they dealing with their colonies, but at home there's a lot of issues. Wealth is highly concentrated. There's a huge gap between the rich and the poor. The old social hierarchy is breaking down as the working and middle classes are growing and pushing for more room. The aristocracy is like shrinking and things are starting to break down, which in Britain is no. Like, tradition is tradition. We do what we do. There's call for social reform, which is causing concern because like this is how we've always done it. Like, don't take away my power. And small riots are popping up everywhere, especially in relation to like workers. We are moving from an agricultural to an industrial society, which means there's going to be change. We're going to get into that a little bit more detail later on. So all I'm going to say is like that's just a big social change. People are moving all over the country. Wealth is shifting. Different types of people are growing. So that's causing some revolution in social norms. And our class structure is being threatened. The ruling class, because of that threat, gets really oppressive. Like, people are trying to take it over from us. No. So they're going to crack down very hard. So to lead to that crackdown, we first need to understand the revolutions that were happening. So yes, 1660 is not in this period, but you need to know some things from back then, because that was only about 100 years before this period starts. So in 1660, we have what's called the Restoration. It's when the monarchy is restored. So there is a brief moment in British history where they are not controlled by the monarchy after the Civil War. So that we had this like Civil War, the Restoration, monarchy comes back, but then they start turning into tyrants again. So in 1688, we have the Bloodless Revolution, which is when the princess has married like a overseas prince and a king, and he comes over and takes over. 1740, and that things get better. Things are like going okay for a little while. Well, we start having the Jacobite rebellions, which is Scotland's upset that that what they believe to be the right king is not the king. So in 1745, they finally squash that rebellion on the island. 1776, the American Revolution starts, and now we also know that the French Revolution is brewing. Originally, British citizens were like, yeah, we support this idea of social change, and yes, the average person should have more rights because they wanted that for themselves. But then it gets out of control, and Britain is like, nope, keep that over there. We don't want that again, because, like I said, they, in the last 100 years, had just gone through a massive civil war that caused a lot of chaos for them, and they don't want to go back to that. So yes, people are still going to be supporting it, but the general feeling is a fear, because they know what can happen if it gets out of control and comes to their island. So, like I mentioned, the ruling class becomes very oppressive. Public meetings get banned. Your right of habeas corpus is suspended. So that's the right to just arbitrarily be imprisoned. So people are just thrown into prison. If you are speaking out for social change, you're being executed for treason, blasphemy, sedition. So you can't speak openly like the previous time, right up until this change. It's been all about civil discourse, about social change and social issues, and now off goes your head. Anti-Protestant feeling is on the rise, and if you haven't studied British history, easiest way to say is that once Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church and established the Anglican Church, Catholics were disliked. So sorry if you practice Catholicism, but big issue in England for a long time, back and forth. You had to be Anglican. Well, then you had the Protestant Reformation, which brought about different Protestant groups. Those cause issues. So basically, if you weren't Anglican, you weren't okay. And this goes back, we swing towards loving Catholics, leaning towards Protestantism, neutral, going back and forth. We kind of settled out, and now it's on the rise again that if you're not Anglican, you're clearly not loyal to Britain. So this is causing issues for people who can't get jobs, can't go to school because of their religion. And then abolition had been growing very steadily, and it gets shut down because any change is a problem. Why is this happening? I've already mentioned it, but the French Revolution is a big concern. And the powers that be in the country are really worried that if they allow any reform or any change, then it's going to lead to extreme violence and insurrection. And we don't want another civil war. Finally getting our feet under us. We're doing great. Well, not doing great, but they feel like they're doing great because they've got their money, they've got their power. So we don't want that. Let's keep it away from us. However, this doesn't stop the push that everybody needs an equal voice in Parliament. People are still crying out for change. It just makes it harder and makes it more dangerous. I mentioned the agricultural changes earlier. So we enclose our fields. That sounds great. People can't come on my property. I can control my fields. My livestock is contained. Yes and no. For the wealthy landowners, this is great. They have extreme power. They have better and more effective agricultural practices. But society in those areas is now destroyed because those were common spaces where everybody could work and grow together to provide for the village, and those are gone now. So the rich and poor gap is just growing. The rich have the land, the poor have nothing. If you don't have land, you don't have a vote. We established laissez-faire, which is don't let the government interfere and control the economy. Good idea, but for workers, it's awful. They don't get adequate wages. They have to work long hours. They're working under cruel conditions. Child labor is out of control. And in Norton, there's a description of how they were hooked up to carts in mines, and they would have to crawl on their hands and knees at the age of 5 to 10, and were dragging carts behind them. And I don't care who you are, that's just unacceptable for a 5 to 10-year-old child to have to do. And we also have this unending cycle of riot and repression. Workers get fed up with this. They protest. They start rioting. they get slammed down. Well, they're slammed down, so they protest and they riot and slam down. It's just non-ending. So there's a lot of upheaval going on. But not everything is doom, despair, dismay in the Romantic period. We have this idea of what it means to be English is revolutionized. So we're emphasizing home and the family heavily for the first time. So that domestic fireside ideal, you too can be part of the royal family. We're all one big family. Women are supported if they start being patriotic in a controlled way. Society sees that women's roles are important to raising the future. So women, we can only rear children, we can only housekeep. This is indoctrinated from books, sermons, magazines. It's forced down their throat. But your morals, your patriotism are important because you are raising the next generation. So, yay, women, we can be patriotic. We can start using our sensible feelings to do good for people, but it's very controlled. Another great thing, women writers are competing with men in sales. They're competing with men in the number of writers, and they're competing with men in reputation, which is huge because up until this point, female writers just weren't really existing. If they did, they were normally kind of private with their friends, but now they've exploded everywhere, which is a great thing to see. And then, like I said, the period ends in 1832 with the Reformation, the first Reform Bill for Parliament, which is a big deal because it does redistribute some seats. And it does fix some of the representation. It doesn't fix everything, but it does establish that change can happen without bloodshed, which means, as a country, we can look at moving forward.